Picture a room in a converted building near the front lines of a war that has killed 2 million people. It is July 27, 1953. The generals are sitting across from each other at a long table. After 2 years of negotiations so brutal that the negotiators stopped making eye contact with each other, they are finally going to end this war. They sign their names. They stand. And then something extraordinary happens. In 12 minutes, without a word spoken, every man in that room gets up and leaves. No handshakes, no photographs of the kind that mark the end of real negotiations. Just the scratch of pens, the sound of chairs, and silence. And somewhere else, miles away, the president of South Korea, the country the entire war had supposedly been fought to protect, was not in that room at all. He had refused to send a representative. He had released 27,000 prisoners specifically to sabotage these talks. He had declared publicly that he would rather fight alone and die than accept this agreement. His name was not on it. His country was not a signatory. What was signed that day was not a peace treaty. It was an armistice, a military ceasefire, a document designed to pause the killing while both sides figured out the permanent settlement that everyone in that room assumed would come within 90 days. 70 years later, that permanent settlement has never come. The Korean War never officially ended, and the question of why, not the diplomatic answer, not the textbook answer, but the real answer that lives in the cables and the back rooms and the strategic calculations of men who knew exactly what they were doing. That question takes us somewhere most histories of this conflict never go. Because when you follow the thread of why America never pushed for a formal peace treaty, you find something that cuts against the story the United States has always told about why it fought in Korea in the first place. You find that the frozen conflict, the permanent state of technical war, was not a failure of diplomacy. For the people with the most power to change it, it was a solution. Let us begin with what was actually signed in that room, because the gap between what was written and what everyone believes was written is the first piece of this puzzle. Most people, if you ask them, will tell you the Korean War ended in 1953. It is in the textbooks, it is in the documentaries, it is in the way Americans stopped paying attention to Korea the moment the fighting stopped. But the document signed on July 27, 1953 was not a peace treaty. It was not even close to one. The Korean Armistice Agreement was a military ceasefire, nothing more and nothing less. It froze the armies in place roughly along the 38th parallel, the same line that had divided Korea before the fighting began. It created the demilitarized zone, that 4-kilometer-wide strip of land that to this day is one of the most heavily armed borders on the planet. It established procedures for exchanging prisoners. And it called explicitly, in its own text, for a political conference to be held within 3 months to resolve the fundamental questions that the armistice had deliberately left open. Questions like, would Korea ever be reunified? Under whose government? Would foreign troops leave? On what terms? The armistice was not the end. It was a comma, a pause, a marker on the road to a settlement that everyone involved understood still had to be negotiated. The fighting would stop. The talking would continue. The war, in its political and legal dimensions, would be resolved at a conference table, not on a hillside in Panmunjom. That conference was held the following spring. It was called the Geneva Conference of 1954, and it lasted from late April to mid-June. The American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles attended. So did representatives from China, the Soviet Union, North Korea, South Korea, and the other nations that had fought under the United Nations flag. They met for 7 weeks in the city that had already witnessed a dozen of history's most significant agreements. They achieved absolutely nothing on Korea. Not a single item. Not a joint communique. Not a framework. Not even an agreed set of principles. The conference collapsed without progress of any kind, and when it ended, the 90-day window the armistice had opened simply closed. Uncompleted. Apparently permanent. And here is the first question that should bother you. Why? Why, after 3 years of the most brutal fighting America had seen since the Second World War, after 36,574 American military deaths, after somewhere between 2 and 3 million Korean civilians killed, after a conflict that had consumed American treasure and American lives, and American political capital on a scale that shocked the country, why did the one chance to formally end that war fail so completely, so quickly? leaving everyone in exactly the situation they had been so desperate to escape. The answer is not that the diplomats were incompetent. It is not that the timing was bad or that the personalities clashed, though all of those things were true. The answer is that by the spring of 1954, the people sitting in that room in Geneva did not actually want the same thing. And one of them had very specific reasons to prefer the world without a peace treaty to the world with one. To understand that, you have to go back before the Armistice, before the negotiations, before the war itself, to the summer of 1950 and the question that has haunted American Korea policy from the very beginning. Why was America there at all? The standard answer is the clean one. North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, and the United States responded under the banner of the United Nations to defend a small democracy against communist aggression. President Truman called it a police action. The UN Security Council authorized military force. 16 nations sent troops. It was collective security in action, the principle that aggression anywhere had to be resisted everywhere, or the lesson of the 1930s would be repeated and a Third World War would become inevitable. That story is true, as far as it goes. The invasion was real, the Security Council authorization was real, and the genuine commitment of American soldiers to the defense of South Korea was real. But there was another layer underneath, a layer that the administration debated with considerably more candor in private than it ever did in public. And it is visible in a document that was written just 5 months before the first North Korean soldiers crossed the 38th parallel. The document is called NSC 68. It was a top-secret National Security Council report, completed in April of 1950, and driven by Paul Nitze, who would spend the next 4 decades as one of the most influential figures in American national security thinking. NSC 68 was a sweeping assessment of the global strategic situation, and its central argument was stark. The Soviet Union was expanding, the communist world was on the march, and the United States needed to dramatically increase its military spending and its global presence if it hoped to contain the threat. There was a problem. The Truman administration could not get Congress to pay for the military buildup that NSC 68 demanded. The war in Europe was over. American troops had come home. The country was in no mood to fund a massive peacetime military establishment on the basis of a theoretical threat from a country that had, after all, just been America's wartime ally. Then, in June of 1950, North Korea invaded, and everything changed. Defense spending, which had been running at roughly $13 billion per year, more than tripled within 2 years to over $50 billion. The permanent military infrastructure that NSC 68 had called for, and that Congress had refused to fund, was suddenly built, paid for, and politically untouchable. The Korean War did not just defend South Korea, it funded the entire Cold War military establishment in a single stroke. Dean Acheson, Truman's Secretary of State, and one of the principal architects of the American response to Korea, was later asked directly whether Korea had been useful in ways beyond the defense of South Korea itself. He acknowledged, in the careful language of a careful man, that the war had made possible things that would otherwise have been politically impossible. And one of those things was this: the permanent stationing of a substantial American military force in East Asia, at the geographic hinge point between Japan, China, and the Soviet Far East, in a location that gave the United States an unparalleled strategic platform for the indefinite future. South Korea, in other words, was not just a country being defended. It was a base. And the presence of American troops on that base, their right to stay there, their permanent deployment in that specific position on the map, all of that required, legally and politically, a continuing state of conflict. Because the moment a formal peace treaty was signed, the question of why American troops were still in Korea would become very difficult to answer. Here is the thing about a peace treaty that almost no one says out loud in the official histories. A peace treaty ends a war. That sounds like an obvious statement, but its implications run deep. When a war formally ends, the legal and political justifications for wartime arrangements end with it. The emergency authorities expire. The deployed forces face questions about their continued presence. The alliances forged in crisis have to be renegotiated on a peacetime basis, where the pressure to come home is harder to resist, and the rationale for staying is harder to articulate. This was not a theoretical concern in Korea. It was a specific, concrete, well-understood problem that shaped American behavior at every stage of the negotiations. The United States had signed a mutual defense treaty with South Korea in October of 1953, just months after the Armistice. That treaty committed the United States to defend South Korea in the event of an attack and provided the legal framework for stationing American troops there. But the presence of those troops was most easily justified, politically and legally, by the ongoing state of conflict that the Armistice represented. A full peace treaty might have changed that calculus. It would certainly have created political pressure in both countries to reduce the American footprint. At the Geneva Conference in 1954, the North Korean and Chinese delegations knew this. Their proposal was unification through all Korean elections supervised by a neutral international commission, combined with the withdrawal of all foreign troops. All of them. United Nations forces out. Chinese forces out. The peninsula cleared of outside armies entirely. For Secretary of State Dulles, this was completely unacceptable. The American position demanded that any elections be supervised by the United Nations. The same United Nations that had fought the war on one side. The same United Nations whose impartiality North Korea had no reason whatsoever to accept. Both sides knew these positions were irreconcilable. Both sides, in different ways and for different reasons, had interests in the status quo that a genuine settlement would have threatened. And so the conference failed, and the armistice became permanent by default. But the story does not end there, because the side that bore the most obvious cost of the frozen conflict was also the side that had the least power to change it. Syngman Rhee is one of the strangest and most consequential figures in 20th century history, and he is almost entirely absent from the American telling of the Korean War. He was 75 years old when the armistice was signed. He had spent decades in exile, advocating for Korean independence, imprisoned by Japanese colonial authorities, educated at Princeton, tireless and combative, and genuinely committed to the liberation of his country from outside control. He was also, by 1953, an autocrat who had manipulated elections, jailed political opponents, and governed South Korea with a combination of anti-communist conviction and personal ruthlessness that made his American backers deeply uncomfortable. And he absolutely, categorically refused to accept the armistice. His objection was not diplomatic posturing. He meant it. He wanted to reunify Korea by force, to push north past the 38th parallel, and keep going until the peninsula was one country under his government. He believed that the armistice betrayed that goal, that it permanently locked Korea into division, and that the United States had sacrificed Korean unity to protect its own strategic position. He was not entirely wrong. When the armistice negotiations reached their final stages in June of 1953, Rhee did something that shocked both sides and nearly wrecked 2 years of painstaking negotiation. Without warning, without coordination with the American military command, he ordered South Korean guards to open the gates of prisoner-of-war camps holding North Korean captives who had refused repatriation. 27,000 of them walked free, just like that, into the South Korean countryside, gone. The armistice had very nearly collapsed over exactly this question: what to do with prisoners who did not want to go home. And Rhee had unilaterally resolved it for 27,000 of them in a single night. The outrage from Washington was immediate and furious. Eisenhower wrote him a letter that historians describe as one of the angriest ever sent by an American president to an allied head of state. Dulles flew to Seoul to manage the crisis. Serious discussions took place in Washington about whether the United States might need to physically remove Rhee from power if he continued to act as a spoiler. It is a remarkable thing to contemplate. The country the war was fought to protect had to be threatened by its own protector to accept the terms that would stop the killing. Rhee eventually backed down, but only after extracting a significant price: the Mutual Defense Treaty, the long-term economic aid, the permanent commitment of American troops. All of these were, in part, the cost of purchasing his agreement not to further undermine the armistice. And those guarantees, once given, themselves became reasons why a formal peace was difficult to negotiate. Because any peace treaty North Korea would accept would almost certainly require concessions that undermined the security commitments Rhee had demanded as the price of his cooperation. The man who refused to sign the armistice had, paradoxically, helped ensure that the armistice could never be upgraded into the peace it was supposed to precede. There is another element to this story that slowly consumed all the others as the decades passed. North Korea acquired nuclear weapons. The path from the Armistice of 1953 to the nuclear tests North Korea began conducting in 2006 is long and winding, and at every stage the frozen conflict helped shape it. A country technically at war with the most powerful military on Earth, a country whose survival depended on deterring an adversary that had previously threatened nuclear first use against it. Because that threat was real and it was made by the Americans, has a rational motivation to develop the one weapon that changes the deterrence equation permanently. Eisenhower's administration had ended the Korean War partly by signaling, not entirely subtly, that nuclear weapons were on the table if the armistice talks collapsed. Historians debate how much that threat accelerated the final agreement, but the North Koreans heard it. And they drew a very specific lesson from it. Conventional armies could be defeated, but nuclear weapons could not be, and the United States would not risk a country that had them. That lesson was reinforced by everything that came afterward. In 2003, Saddam Hussein's Iraq was invaded and destroyed. His government had abandoned its weapons of mass destruction program. In 2011, Muammar Gaddafi's Libya collapsed after Western military intervention. He had surrendered his nuclear program in 2003 in exchange for normalized relations. The pattern, from Pyongyang's perspective, was unmistakable. The countries that gave up their weapons did not survive. The one country the United States had threatened with nuclear weapons in Korea was the country that responded by building its own. As North Korea's nuclear capability grew, the prospects for a formal peace treaty shrank in direct proportion. No American administration could sign a peace treaty that implicitly normalized a nuclear-armed North Korea without addressing that program. And North Korea made clear, repeatedly and explicitly, that its nuclear weapons were the direct product of the ongoing threat it faced. A threat that had never been formally resolved, because a peace that would have resolved it had never been signed. Denuclearization and peace were, in North Korea's framing, the same negotiation. And neither side could afford to lose it. Here is the detail that the official narrative tends to skip over, the one that matters when you pull back from the history and ask the harder question. Who actually benefits from the Korean War never officially ending? The South Korean population does not benefit. They live under the permanent shadow of a conflict that could, in theory, resume at any moment. The Seoul metropolitan area, home to nearly half of South Korea's 52 million people, sits within artillery range of the North Korean border. Every generation of South Korean men has grown up with mandatory military service and a civil defense infrastructure built on the assumption that the war is not really over. The North Korean population does not benefit. They live under one of the most repressive governments in human history, a government that has justified every deprivation, every restriction, every exercise of absolute control, partly on the basis of the ongoing external threat. The frozen conflict is the oxygen the regime breathes, the permanent emergency that demands obedience, the existential crisis that makes loyalty a matter of survival. The people who benefit, and here is where the history becomes genuinely uncomfortable, are the institutions and interests that require the Korean Peninsula to remain exactly as it is. The American military presence in South Korea, currently around 28,500 troops, is one of the largest overseas deployments in the world. It exists because of the Armistice, because of the ongoing state of technical war, because the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1953 was premised on a conflict that was not over. It provides the United States with a forward military base at the geographic heart of East Asia, close to China, close to Russia's Pacific coast, within reach of every major power in the region. That presence is worth something that is very difficult to quantify and almost never discussed in the official reasoning for why America stays. It is not only a deterrent against North Korea. It is a piece of the strategic architecture of American power in the Pacific, a platform that sits in a location that no amount of money, no bilateral negotiation, no peacetime argument could easily secure if the conflict that justifies it were formally resolved. Several serious analysts of American security policy have made this point over the years, quietly and carefully. The political scientist Bruce Cummings, who has written what many consider the definitive history of the Korean War, argued that the American military presence in Korea has always served purposes beyond the defense of South Korea, that it is embedded in a broader strategic logic that treats the peninsula as a platform, not merely as an ally to be protected. That does not mean no one in Washington genuinely wants peace on the Korean peninsula. People do. It does not mean the frozen conflict is maintained by cynical calculation in the way a conspiracy theory would frame it. The reality is more diffuse and in some ways more damning than a conspiracy, because it does not require anyone to consciously choose to keep the war frozen. It just requires that the people with the power to unfreeze it have enough other interests pulling in enough different directions to ensure that nothing ever quite comes together. The history of Korean peace negotiations is, in many ways, a history of near misses. The most dramatic came in June of 2000, when South Korean President Kim Dae-jung crossed the border into North Korea for a summit with Kim Jong-il. The photographs of the two Korean leaders shaking hands, the joint declaration they signed, the genuine emotion visible in the faces of people who had not seen family members in half a century. It seemed briefly like something was genuinely shifting. Kim Dae-jung won the Nobel Peace Prize. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright flew to Pyongyang in October, the highest-level American contact with North Korea in history, and came back with signals that a deal on missiles and nuclear questions might be possible. Clinton seriously considered making the trip himself. He did not. The Camp David negotiations with the Israelis and Palestinians collapsed and consumed the final months of the administration. The election of 2000 followed. George W. Bush took office and placed North Korea in the axis of evil in his first State of the Union address, and the opening closed. The next serious moment came in 2018, in circumstances almost no one had predicted. Donald Trump, who had spent the previous year exchanging nuclear threats with Kim Jong-un, announced that he would meet the North Korean leader directly. The Singapore summit produced a joint statement that included, for the first time in decades, an explicit commitment to building a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean peninsula. The word peace appeared in an official U.S.-North Korea document. The follow-up summit in Hanoi in February of 2019 collapsed. The two sides could not agree on the scope of North Korean denuclearization in exchange for sanctions relief. The Americans wanted full denuclearization first. The North Koreans wanted partial relief for partial steps. They were nowhere near a framework, and the summit ended without a joint statement of any kind, both leaders departing in opposite directions. The pattern held. Every serious attempt to formally end the Korean War has run into the same interlocking set of obstacles. North Korea will not denuclearize without security guarantees it does not trust. The United States will not provide security guarantees without denuclearization it cannot verify. South Korea wants unification on its own terms, and fears being traded away in great power negotiation. China wants stability on the peninsula, but not a unified Korea that would host American troops on its border. Japan wants the North Korean threat contained, but not so completely that American strategic attention shifts elsewhere. Each party gains something from the frozen conflict and risks something by resolving it. And that interlocking structure of interests has proven, for 7 decades, more durable than any combination of diplomatic creativity, presidential ambition, or genuine human desire to finish what the Armistice left unfinished. So here is what the evidence actually shows, stated as plainly as the facts allow. The Korean War did not end in 1953 because what was signed in that room was never designed to be an ending. It was a pause, pending a resolution that collapsed almost immediately at Geneva. The resolution failed not because the diplomats were inept, but because the parties had incompatible interests that a peace treaty would have forced into the open in ways the Armistice conveniently avoided. The United States did not push hard for a formal peace, because the frozen conflict preserved a strategic position that formal peace might have jeopardized. Not through any secret conspiracy, not through any single decision by any individual actor, but through the accumulated logic of 1,000 smaller choices made by people who each had their own reasons for preferring the world as it was. North Korea did not accept a peace treaty because the ongoing conflict justified the regime, and because, once it acquired nuclear weapons, trading them for a piece of paper signed by an adversary it did not trust was a gamble its leadership was unwilling to make. The very weapons the frozen conflict helped inspire became the reason the conflict could not be unfrozen. And South Korea, the country the war was fought to defend, whose name was not on the Armistice, whose president tried to wreck the negotiations at the last possible moment, has lived for 7 decades in a state of technical war that has shaped every dimension of its national life. Governed by an agreement it never signed, protected by a presence it both depends on and has complicated feelings about, waiting for a resolution that everyone agrees must someday come, and that no one has yet found a way to deliver. The Korean War is not a forgotten war, as it is sometimes called. It is an unfinished one, and the reason it is unfinished is not some accident of history, not some failure of will, not some tragedy of missed timing. It is the deliberate or semi-deliberate product of a set of interests that found the permanent pause more manageable than any available conclusion. When powerful countries make commitments they cannot fully honor, when they fight wars for reasons they cannot fully disclose, when the settlements they reach are designed to be temporary by people who suspect they will not be. The gap between what was promised and what was delivered is paid for by the people who had the least power to change any of it. The Korean Peninsula is still divided. The DMZ still stands. The Armistice is still the only law of that border. And the people who live on both sides of it have been waiting for more than 70 years for an ending that the more powerful parties to their conflict have never quite found it in their interest to write. If you stayed all the way to the end of this one, leave a single match in the comments. Just so I know who kept watching. And if you think history deserves to be told straight, with the myths pulled apart and the evidence laid out honestly, subscribe, because that is exactly what we do here, every week. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.